Hi everyone, my name is Devin. I'm a developer relations engineer supporting the Google Ads API, and welcome to episode 6 in our series about Performance Max for developers. In this episode, we'll be talking about listing group filters. Before I dive in, remember to hit that like button if you're enjoying the episode, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. That way you can stay up to date with all of the latest content. Finally, we'd love to hear from you. How have you been using these videos? Have you been using the interactive guide? If so, or if maybe you have questions for us, let us know down in the comments. Without further ado, let's dive in. If you've been following along in this series, you might recognize this diagram from the last episode where we talked about asset groups. In the episode before that, we talked about PMax retail campaigns. If we take this diagram and now say we want to make this a retail campaign, what would we do? Well, we'd add some shopping settings, which we talked about in episode 4. In addition, we need to let each asset group know which products to include for that given asset group. And we do that with one or more listing group filters, which combine to form a product partition tree, which specifies to the asset group which products to include and which products to exclude. To make this simpler, let's take a look at the product partition tree we'll create for just the drums asset group. Here's a graphical representation of what a product partition tree might look like. Now, what does this actually say? Include all products that are not sold through the local product channel and have a brand name of Bang or Boom drums. Now, if you're trying to connect the dots, how does this tree translate into what I just said? We're going to break it down right now for you and also explain the different components of a product partition tree and how to create one. Before I go any further, one thing you might notice is that a tree has nodes, right? And I'm representing these nodes as these little boxes. Each one of these nodes is an asset group listing group filter. And when we combine these asset group listing group filters together in a specific way, we form our tree that indicates to the asset group which products to include and which ones to exclude. Taking this a step further, you can actually have a tree with just one node, like shown here. This is a completely valid tree. And all this is saying is I have a single node that includes all products, and I want to include all products. So if I were to attach this node to my asset group, basically what it would say is in my asset group, include every single product specified in my Merchant Center settings that I went through in episode 4. All right, so let's make this a little more complex by adding one more level to our tree. And now what this tree is saying is include all products in my asset group that are not sold through the local sales channel. Okay, that's great, but let's break that down a little bit further. Each one of these nodes is an asset group listing group filter in the Google Ads API. Let's go through some of the properties of those nodes. So first of all, each one is associated with a given asset group. Well, that makes sense because of how we're using them. And the way that we specify the given asset group is by including the asset group ID in the resource name of the node that we're creating. And because we're using a bulk mutate operation to create both the asset group and the listing group filters, and therefore the product partition tree at the same time, we'll manually set that resource name on the asset group listing group filter object. That resource name will include the asset group temporary ID, a temporary ID that we generate specifically for each node, and of course the customer ID. And one of the common things I've done throughout this series is use arrows to indicate how temporary IDs are used to kind of illustrate the relationship between entities. And as you can see, the arrow is pointing from the asset group to the nodes, meaning we use the temporary ID of the asset group in those nodes. Now, if we look at the tree again, I've also included arrows here. And this is to illustrate how the nodes are connected together. And we do that by specifying a parent resource name on a given asset group listing group filter. Now keep in mind the root node at the very top, that won't have a parent, but all other nodes in the tree will. So as I mentioned in the previous slide, we create a new temporary ID for each node that we create. Now, what we'll do in subsequent nodes is use that temporary ID from the parent in the parent resource name to effectively create the tree structure that you see here. And again, you can see the arrows indicate how we'll use the temporary IDs. Now, finally, there are a few other properties that I want to discuss about asset group listing group filters, or our nodes. First is vertical, and in this specific case, for Performance Max Retail, this is always going to be shopping. Next is type, and there are three different types that we'll generally work with: subdivision, unit included, or unit excluded. If a node is a subdivision node, it means that it has children. Or a better way of thinking that means that other nodes refer to that node as their parent. The next type is unit excluded, which means we want to exclude products from that category in our asset group. And then unit included means we, of course, want to include those products in our asset group. Now, finally, I want to talk about a field called case value. And this is basically how we determine what value to filter on. This is our filtering dimension. There are 7 different options for dimensions that we can filter on. So we have product bidding category, brand, channel, condition, custom attribute, item ID, and product type. So if you look in the second row of our tree here, you can see that we're filtering on product channel. The main options here are local or online. Local being items that are purchased in store in a local location versus online, obviously. And finally, just to wrap this all up, if you look at that bottom left node that says local, what this is saying is we want to exclude any products that have the product channel of local. Now, there is one more important thing I want to talk about as it relates to product partition trees. If you look at the 2 nodes in the bottom level of our tree, we have local and then we have all other. So this all other node is very important. It's basically a catch-all of all products that don't fit into the other nodes of that tree. Each level of the tree has to have an all other products node in order for the tree to be a valid product partition tree. As you can see here, we've added another filtering dimension, and now we're taking that all other products node from the second level, and we're then breaking that out based on product brand. And here we're saying products with the brand Bang or Boom are unit included nodes, so we want to include those nodes. And then everything else, that all other node, we want to exclude that. Throughout this series, I've been making use of the interactive guide for creating Performance Max campaigns to serve as an illustrative tool and really help you get started with your integration. You can create listing group filters with the interactive guide, and I'll show you how to do that in just a minute. But before we dive in, I just wanted to call out a few caveats of building product partition trees using the interactive guides tool. And most of these stem from the fact that it's kind of hard to write code that writes code that does something as complex as creating a product partition tree. So hopefully this gets you a lot of the way, but I just want you to understand some of the constraints in the tool versus what's possible in the API. So the first thing that I want to point out is that each level of the tree is split on an individual node. So if you look at this tree here, you can see that we split only on the all other products node in the second level, right? Now, theoretically, I could also split on the local node. The way the interactive guide works, it assumes that you only split on a single node in each level. Taking that a step further, it always assumes that you split on that other node. So in the interactive guide, you can't split on the local node. Instead, you have to split on all other. In the API, that's possible, but I just wanted to make sure that was clear. Finally, in the last level of our tree, we always assume that that all other products node is a unit excluded node. Keep in mind the interactive guide is an educational tool, so hopefully it illustrates these concepts, gets you most of the way there, and then you can figure out a way to use the API to address your specific integration. Now that we understand some of the caveats of using the interactive guide, I want to talk through the implementation choices that I made. So one of the big ones is how to structure the data for all of these different nodes. What I've done is I've decided to use a nested array with 3 different levels, basically representing each one of the nodes. Now, the first level of our tree is for a given asset group. So each asset group is a different item in the array. Now, if we look at a specific asset group, Then what I do is I have a different nested array within that first level of the array for each level in the tree. And then finally, the third level of our nested array is the individual nodes in the individual level of the tree for a given asset group. And hopefully this picture helps illustrate that. So part of the reason for the caveats I addressed earlier is because of how I wrote the code. Basically what I do is I take any of the, what I'm calling nodes with information in them, these three that you see that aren't crossed out here, I include those in my nested array, and then everything else is automated. So in other words, I take a look at the tree, right? And if it's just a single node in a single level of a given tree for an asset group, I know that that's a single node tree. I'll make that a unit included node, and that's it. Otherwise, if there are children nodes on that root node, I'll just make that a subdivision node automatically. So I don't have to declare that node. That's why I've crossed that out. I don't need to worry about it. In addition, I can automate some of the logic that creates the all other products nodes. So for example, in any given level of the tree, what I'll do is I'll see, is this the last level of the tree? If it is, I'll automatically create an all other products node that is of type unit excluded. However, if it's not the last level of the tree, I'll include an all other products node with a type of subdivision. As you can see here, this is what my array might look like graphically on the left to create the product partition group you see on the right. Hopefully these graphics have been helpful in illustrating these concepts conceptually, but let's tie it all together now with the code. Here we are in the interactive guide. If you want to take a look at listing group filters, all you have to do is head on over to the listing group filters section. There's some information here, and this explains some of the caveats I was explaining earlier. They're also documented in the code itself. But before I go ahead and start working with the different levels of the trees and the different nodes, I want to point something out. So as I mentioned, there's a product partition tree for each individual asset group. And if this is a retail campaign, that means that each asset group has to have a product partition tree. It's a one-to-one relationship. So if I go back to asset group operations, and let's say I add a couple of asset groups. Now, if I head back to listing group filters, I now have 3 different items for listing group filters. And keep in mind, these aren't 3 individual asset group listing group filters. These are 3 collections of asset group listing group filters, which combined form a product partition tree for each individual asset group. So for now, I just want to focus on creating the product partition tree that we just showed in that example. So I'm going to head back to asset group operations. I'll get rid of those other 2. Go back to listing group filters, and now you can see there's only one set of listing group filters that we want to worry about. So as I said, there's always the root node. I don't have to create that. It'll automatically be created for me. Let's go into level 1. And as you recall, we were filtering on product channel. Now, if I head back into nodes, verticals always shopping, our filter type was unit excluded, and we have a product channel of local. And that's all there is to it to create that first level. So as you can see, we have our nested array here. And this first level represents each one of the collections of listing group filters for each individual asset group. And then the next level you can see here is for the different levels within the tree for a given asset group. And then finally, this third level, which we're adding a node to, is for the individual nodes in the tree's level. So now let's go ahead and add that second level. So we'll go to level 2, filtering dimension on brand, nodes. For included, it was bang. We'll add another node, unit included for boom. Now we head back to our code. And now you can see this is level 1 here, and this is level 2. So let's start by taking a look at that very first node that we created, right? What we do is we call nodes.add, and we add this node just using a method we haven't talked about yet called channel-listing-group-filter. So if you take a look at this method, what we're doing is we're creating an asset group listing group filter for a product channel. Now, the method signatures of all these other different types of filtering dimensions are going to follow a very similar structure. We build an object for the filtering dimension that we're filtering on. In this case, product channel. So we create a new builder for the product channel. If the channel is present in our list of parameters, then we'll set the product channel that was provided. So in our case, it would be local, so we would include local, and we'd set the channel to local. Then what we do is we create a generic listing group filter dimension object with the product channel set. We build that, and then we return an AssetGroupListingGroupFilter, which is created using this generic createListingGroupFilter method, which takes a dimension as well as a listing group filter type. I want to just take a minute and pause to point out this null check that we have here. So why do we have that, right? If we're always setting a product channel, well, why would it ever be none, and why wouldn't we set this? Well, this is to account for that all other products node. When we create an all other products node, we pass in null as the product channel. So instead of setting the channel with a particular value, we'll just create the listing group filter dimension with a product channel that doesn't have any value set. Now quickly, just for the sake of comparison, let's look at the method to create those individual brand nodes. So heading back here, we can see that that method is named brand listing group filter. Now here we are at the brand listing group filter method, and you can see this is almost identical to the last method we just looked at. The difference is, instead of a product channel builder here, we have product brand here. We have the same null check to determine whether we set the value, which is based on whether or not this is an all other products node. We create a dimension, and then we return our asset group listing group filter by calling the method createListingGroupFilter with our dimension and listing group filter type. This method just takes in a dimension and a listing group filter type, which is basically just a pass-through parameter from whatever the calling method was. And it creates an asset group listing group filter. It sets the type that we specified as the parameter. It sets the vertical, which is always going to be shopping, which I discussed before. And then finally, if dimension is not equal to null, it'll set the case value on that node and return the asset group listing group filter. And why do we check if the dimension's null? Well, the only reason that might be null is if we're creating the root node, in which case there is no dimension that we're filtering on. So now we know how to create the individual nodes, which go into the bottom level of our nested array. Those get grouped together into the different tree levels, which you can see here. And then once again, each of the tree levels gets added to the asset group listing filter's top level list, which we'll then use to create the entire product partition tree. So I've kind of mentioned this a few times already, but I've chosen to make this a very declarative approach and use a lot of boilerplate code to actually create the entire product partition tree. And I just want to show you why that's useful. So when I'm customizing this code to create my tree, right, there's only really 9 lines of individual code that I've custom written. Everything else is boilerplate. You can see how that makes an implementation a lot easier. So now that I have my nested list, let's take a look at what I'm actually doing with it to create that product partition tree. So the first thing I'll do is I'm just going to loop through the top level of that list, which represents the different product partition trees for each individual asset group. Now, if you watched the prior episode, you'll know that when we created the individual asset groups, we saved the temporary ID for each one in a class level list. And this is the reason why. Now we're accessing those, and because we created them in the same order that we're creating the listing group filters, which are associated with each asset group, we know that there's a one-to-one relationship, and we can use the same index to reference both the asset group temporary ID as well as a given item in our top level list. So if you look here, we iterate through the top level of that list. We get the asset group ID. Then we call a method called createAssetGroupListingGroupFilters, which creates and returns a list of operations that create asset group listing group filters, which we then add to our list of operations. And then finally, we return our entire operations list so that it can be used in our bulk mutate operation. So let's take a deeper dive into this method, createAssetGroupListingGroupFilters. Basically what this method is doing, createAssetGroupListingGroupFilters, it's taking care of all of the boilerplate. So the first thing we're going to do is just create the root node. To do that, first we need a temper ID for that root node. Then we'll check if that root node has any children. If not, we know it's a single node tree representing all products. So if that's the case, I'm just going to make this in a unit excluded node, a single node tree. Otherwise, we know this has to be a subdivision node. Then in order to create the root node, or I should say partially create that root node, we'll call a method createListingGroupFilter, which we've already seen. We'll pass in null for the dimension, since this is the root node, and the root filter type, which is either subdivision or unit included. I said just a moment ago, and I didn't mention this earlier, but that createListingGroupFilter method only partially creates the AssetGroupListingGroupFilter. And you'll notice that we set the dimension on it, we set the type, we set the vertical, but what we didn't do is we didn't cover the resource name or the parent resource name that we discussed earlier. And we do that in the createListingGroupFilter operation method, which completes the build of that object and then wraps it in an operation that will be added to our lists. Now, the reason that we do that is because order is very important when we work with bulk mutate operations. So in this case, we always provide the parent ID and the parent resource name to subsequent children nodes. But since we created those nodes earlier in our list, we don't know what the root resource name is, or the root temporary ID is, that we can use in that child node. So this is how we account for that. So if we look at this createListingGroupFilter operation method, you can see here what it does is it sets the resource name. If there is a parent resource name, meaning it's not the root node, we'll set the parent resource name, and then we'll just wrap this in a mutate operation that creates an AssetGroupListingGroupFilter. If we head back into the calling method, so the next thing that we do is we actually create each one of the levels in the tree. So we'll iterate through the tree level of the nested array. Then what we'll do is we'll set the parent node ID, which is either the temporary filter ID, which is from the root node, which will be the case in the first iteration, or if we're in another level of the tree, besides the first level we create, this will be the other node ID. Then we'll iterate through each node in a given tree level and create each one of those nodes. As you can see here, we need temporary IDs for each of the nodes, and then we construct the node resource name, the parent resource name, and then we just call that createListingGroupFilter operation with the node that we created above and add it to our list of operations. Then finally, what we'll do is we'll create the all other products node for each level of the tree. And as we discussed earlier, if this is not the last level of the tree, meaning this level has children, we'll make this a subdivision node because we always divide on the other nodes in this example, even though that's not the case in the API. Otherwise, if this is the last level of the tree, we'll make this a unit excluded node. And then finally, we call this createOtherNode method, which basically is just a switch function to create an AssetGroupListingGroupFilter with a given dimension that doesn't have any value. So with that, we've created all of the operations. We'll return a list of operations. And if this is a PMax retail campaign, and we head into the overview method, you can see that we have a method to add all listing group filter operations. And that will be added to our bulk mutate operation. And all of those asset group listing group filters will be created along with our campaign budget, our campaign, our asset groups, our audience signals, and everything else we need to create our valid serving PMax campaign for retail. All right, that was a lot of information. This is not an easy topic to explain, so I tried to do it conceptually, graphically, with code, with the interactive guide. I hope this was really helpful for you. I'm hoping that one of those different methodologies really helped make this stick, or maybe kind of seeing them all. If you wouldn't mind, if you found one way more helpful than the other, let us know in the comments. That's really helpful for us to know what types of content to make for you all going forward. So that's kind of the end of our 6th episode in this series. In the next episode, we'll flip back to kind of our asset group topic, and we'll talk about asset group assets, which is how we connect assets from our account level asset library to a given asset group. With that, I'll see you next time.